Hello there, Rodney from Super License, and with me, a very, very special guest, a new friend of the show, Stuart Codling, and I believe you like to be called Codders. Codders, can I call you Codders? If not, too late.
You may, and you've already started. It's basically how most people call me, and I don't really. It's quite weird if I hear people shouting Stuart. I think they must be talking to someone else. And on our magazine, there are two Stuarts, so Codders actually helps distinguish between the two.
Absolutely love that. It's one of those things that I don't have being a Rodney. There's not that many around, but I know, I went to school with like three Matts. So the teacher would say, "Hey, Matt," and they'd all like me. Like, I was never a fan of that.
Yeah. Being Australian, you'd never be mistaken for Rodney from Only Fools and Horses.
Everybody from the UK that I talk to mentions that. Like, are you a fan of Only Fools and Horses? I feel like I've seen it once. It's not a real cultural touchstone here, but it's the one that I get.
Have you ever had a low over there, the British comedy program?
Mm-hmm. We had that. Grew up with that.
Oh yes. Well, imagine Charles Leclerc's bafflement when he appeared on the Formula One radar, and people from Britain were always tweeting at him, "Psst, it is I, Leclerc."
Yep. Well, I mean, he's a very affable guy, and I'm sure he would have played along to his own bewilderment until someone sent him a TikTok or something.
Yes. I doubt if he'll be dressing up as Herr Flick of the Gestapo anytime soon.
Well, I mean, look, there's lots of places we could go with that, but we have things to talk about. And the thing that has brought us together, which I'm very pleased and grateful for, is you've only gone and released your 500th book. So this is why we're speaking today. Let's talk a little bit about that and get that obligation done. And then we can circle back to it as many times as we want. But tell us about this book. Tell us when you started thinking about it and what makes it timely now, because I think you really it's dropping at the perfect time.
Well, yes. And it's pure luck, because when I actually was writing it, they weren't having a very good time of it at all, and there was yet another technical restructure. The fact is that we did, just before the pandemic hit, I did with the same publisher a Ferrari car by car, all the Formula One cars, which got well reviewed, apart from the people who went, what about the one that was entered in the non-championship race in 1950?
Hard to believe there's any people like that in the Formula One sphere. Hard to believe that.
Indeed, you won't believe the amount of time we spent trying to track down pictures of this car, and when we found one, I actually realised it was probably mislabeled because it didn't have the right numbers on it. So even if we had put it in, the pedants would have been not satisfied. But anyway, yeah, and then that was due to be published in 2020, and then I don't know, a bat defecated in a pangolin's mouth somewhere in China, and all of a sudden there was this bug going around. I don't know if you remember, and it got delayed. We had to shoehorn another chapter in for another car, and it was published a year later.
Wow, yeah, I can relate to that. But I mean, to be clear, because we haven't read it out by name yet, or really dropped the ball for anyone who's not clued in. This book is called McLaren Formula One Car by Car: Every Race Car Since 1966. Now, Codders, I don't go back to 1966, but these cars are very good looking. But I'm sure there's a lot of people who are getting that nostalgic tingle. But also, I'm wondering whether, for example, you know how the kids these days are all like buying vinyl and stuff like that. I'm wondering how many of the modern kids who have been turned on to Formula One by Drive to Survive, and I know you've got a book that you did that was a companion book to that as well, but how many of the kids are going to go, I'm interested in that because this is something I can hold and it's a way to physically express my fandom?
Oh yeah, they can look back longingly at the days when all cars just looked like cigar tubes and that sort of thing. But yeah, certainly the Ferrari F1 book. But once China had unlocked and it could actually get printed and be distributed and sent around the world in plastic pouches and all sanitized, so that no bats were involved in the making of that. It actually sold quite well, and the publishers were happy with it, so I thought, well, yeah, why don't we do a McLaren one as well, because they've got a great unbroken history. I mean, apart from the massive gap between win number 182 and 183, but we'll go back to that later. So I thought let's do a McLaren book, and they said, yeah, great. So yeah, that was the long and the short of it. We did it, and McLaren, even though they've had periods of colossal dominance where people went, it's a bit boring. The story of the team is sort of so epic, and they have a huge fan base as well. And of course, now they're taking on Ferrari as a road car manufacturer. So the publishers didn't say, well, that's never going to sell. Do one, mate. So I wrote it, and hopefully people will buy it. And who knows? I mean, I'm never going to write a history of Andrea Moda or.
Please go on.
Yeah.
What do we have to pay you for you to do that?
The footwork arrow story, possibly slightly niche, I think.
Could be.
Yeah. Brabham maybe, but yeah, it's not going to be a massive niche. This, but
it's an obvious follow-on from the Ferrari book, and I'm sure there's never a bad time to publish a book about Ferrari. But like I kind of said before, this seems to be a really good time to be dropping a book about McLaren. Certainly better than 10 years ago, say. So yeah, I did want to know whether you just got lucky or not. Obviously, things have been improving for McLaren for a long time. So even if you were like working on it a few years ago, the pieces were starting to fall in place at that team. So, I mean, they were headed in the right direction. There's other teams where you wouldn't say that about them at all right now. They're probably headed in the opposite direction. But when you write a book about them in 30 years, maybe they'll have turned it around by then.
Yeah, when I wrote the sample chapter, which is one of the things. It's weird, isn't it? You've written the umpteen books for the same publisher, but you still have to write a sample chapter so that someone, the kind of guy who used to wield a BlackBerry in the corner of the board meeting, but now probably has a phablet or something like that, can say, "Oh yeah, that's okay." So it goes off to be a design mock-up, and they look around and go, "Oh yeah, this is fine." I actually did that, during a quiet period of the Monaco Grand Prix last year. So that was when it started. And obviously we'd gone through the whole proposal business. So probably the whole business of discussing it and thrashing out the plan happened right at the beginning of last year, when McLaren were having a nightmare. The car was the slowest on the grid. And, by an epic feat of silk personification, by the time I'd finished the book, they had turned the current car around, to the extent that we actually, the last chapter, because obviously book publishers don't have crystal balls. So although the book's coming out now, it doesn't have the 2024 car in it, because it was printed and bound before the 2024 car launches. Book publishing just grinds even more slowly than magazine publishing. But we actually we swapped out some of the pictures of the last car to reflect the changes that had occurred, because right at the end at the Singapore Grand Prix, they were bolting on upgrades that massively changed it. So the book did evolve as it went along. Fortunately, we didn't have to stick another section in it, and because there was no new pandemic and a long wait for it to actually come out.
Definitely, and I mean, it's the sort of book that's come along with that, and I think. What's the hook of the book? Obviously, the hook is, well, there's cars, and they look great. But I was surprised flicking through the pages how it's not just glossy photos of the cars. It's more than that. And it's not even just information about the cars, because like you say, McLaren is has one of the most storied histories in Formula One. But it's not just, like, there's so many things to get a hold of. So there's the cars, the technical part of it, and you've got some diagrams, and you've got some select photos that I think show off what was unique about the cars throughout the years. So this car had this specific element. Here's photos that really show that, but also beautiful photos of the cars. Then there's the team and the story of the founding and the history of it. Then there's all the unique personalities. And then talking about the unique personalities, you get to talk about all these great races from over the years. So it's just, I was actually surprised you fit it all into such a small number of pages rather than the other way around.
That comes from the discipline of writing for magazines. There's a strict word count you have to fulfill for each car, and you can overwrite, but the designer's just going to let it hang off
Chop, chop.
the end, because that's what designers are like. It's like,
Sure.
you can't overwrite, mate. It's someone's gonna come along and chop it, so it might as well be the author. So yeah, you get used to writing through a word count. It's a little bit like an actor hitting their marks when they're filming something. If you don't hit your mark, then the camera's not going to be focused on where you're standing. So the thing you have to do is, it is quite tricky, is you've got all the missions of, you've got to tell the story of the team as it moves through the years. You've got to tell the story of the people within the team, because people come and go and there are arguments, the cars get developed, and you have to tell the story of the cars themselves. So you have to sort of have that balancing act all the way through, and inevitably there will be some readers who say, oh, you didn't go into enough detail about the car, and that's something you even get with magazines, and particularly stuff I've written that then gets published on the net, because I work for the organization that includes autosport.com and motorsport.com, and inevitably there'll be someone in the comments go, well, you missed this, you didn't say what jumper Fangio was wearing when he arrived for the 1955 British Grand Prix, because it was a bit chilly in Liverpool. My response to those people is always, well, there's only room for so many words in this bucket, and if you want to put that in, something else has to come out. So it's a balancing act. It is tricky.
Yeah, and I mean, there's always an opportunity to write a book about those great seasons. And I mean, it's funny that you talk about people having favorite cars or looking for specific things, because I got these pages and I straight away went to 98 to see like what has he written about it, what are the photos that he's used, because 98 was obviously just an amazing season. The car has such a story to tell. It was my first year not just watching Formula One, but I was like instantly obsessed with Formula One. It was really crazy because they had that first race in Melbourne. Very, number one, the car turned out to be, had a special superpower, but that was hidden. Number two, the politics of that race in Melbourne 1998. And I was just instantly like attracted to the sport, the personalities, the politics. And obviously it was a high point for McLaren. So it straight away for me, I'm like, what's the section about 98? But I can obviously imagine, hey, there's only 3 pages about that thing, the same as there's 3 pages about a nondescript year. So that's where it must get difficult.
Yes. When we planned the book out, basically you have kind of like a budget of how many pages there are, and we have a sort of a different level of detail depending on how much we want to allocate to each car. So we kind of think the cars that were maybe a little bit less significant or successful, we'd have them the smallest permissible levels, and then the ones that are a bit more epic you can have more pages to, and that then gives you more words to use.
Sure.
But you find that your budget goes quite quickly, so you have to be very very disciplined. And it's the only time I ever get involved in spreadsheets is when planning these books, and I do the little sum of the cells as I get to the bottom and work out that I'm still 50 pages over on my ideal thing. Yeah, okay, right. Let's trim here and there, because as you say, I left that out of my initial list a couple of minutes ago. You have the evolution of the sport and the politics that goes on throughout Formula One, but also more recently, certainly in the Max Mosley era, there was something going on every single season, some ridiculous nonsense he would spring on the unsuspecting Formula One public. And actually, it's probably quite good that life has panned out the way it has, because Max Mosley's no longer around to make my life difficult if I say what I think about him. So, he did a great job in some respects, but he was also a nasty bully, and he didn't really tolerate dissent. So I think it's quite good to be able to weigh up his achievements in a properly balanced way without him threatening to yank your pass or whatever, as he used to do quite frequently if you'd written anything that he didn't agree with or didn't like over the preceding season. You'd arrive in Melbourne for the first Grand Prix of the year as it was, and something's gone wrong. Your pass hasn't been printed. You'll have to wait a couple of days or something. Yeah, that used to go on.
He does come up a little bit in the index. I see he's mentioned on more pages than Juan Pablo Montoya. So he gets a mention in the book. I'll have to have another read with that framing to be like, what is he saying and what is Codders not saying?
Well, yeah, it was a bit of a massive fix, I think, at the time. When you look at when Max got in as president of the FIA, he was very much. It was known in Formula One that basically he didn't visit the toilet unless Bernie said so. So that made their final schism at the end when they did have a few little domestics all the more bittersweet, I suppose.
Well, I mean, we can move on to maybe more pleasant things, the things that we want to talk more about in the positive light. I mean, what else can we get into in the book? There's obviously the driver tussles that have happened at McLaren over the years, and obviously there's the 2007 one, which is infamous, and then the amazing redemption in 2008. So, are those sections of the book that was it? I guess we've talked about it being hard to trim it down, obviously, but was it hard to be like, I wish I could write a book just about that?
Yeah, well, actually, I think a whole book has been written about 2007.
Maurice Hamilton's done a good one.
Spygate, good old Morris. Yes, great book. And there's so much stuff that happened in that season to McLaren in terms of the development of the car, the very strange relationship between Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. And yeah, I feel quite privileged to have been there. I went to about 8 or 9, maybe 10 Grand Prix that season. So I saw a lot of it. I was at the Hungarian Grand Prix when that whole nonsense happened around qualifying. And I was actually in the press conference where there was some economical with the actuality going on, and I remember it very, very vividly because Lewis Hamilton wasn't there to begin with. I could have filled a whole chapter just describing this one press conference, so it had to get squashed. Very, very hard to describe that season in one chapter. But this press conference in Hungary, Lewis wasn't there. He arrived late and said he'd been watching the GP2 race in somewhere. Actually, he'd gone to the stewards to squeal on Fernando for holding him up in the pits. So the press conference began with Ron Dennis there and Fernando Alonso next to him, munching on a peach. Now, what some listeners may not know is that the infamously punctilious and pristine Ron Dennis did not like soft fruit. He found it gross. So Fernando was deliberately sort of and as Ron embarked on this typically Ron Dennis, very, very wordy explanation of what had happened that was slightly economical with the truth. At the end of it, he said, "Isn't that right, Fernando?" And just as he turned around to Fernando sort of went. And you could see bits of peach being masticated in his mouth as he nodded, and Ron just sort of went, like,
yeah, having a coronary
out of horror. So he actually scuttled off. Lewis arrived. Norbert Haug then became like Piggy in the middle, supposedly moderating this thing, and neither driver talking to one another, and the massive number of press. Like there are actually pictures on the Motorsport Images website taken from the upper floor of the McLaren brand center of this huge throng of journalists. You can actually pick out a much younger me in there on the left, and they're pinging questions, quite difficult questions at Lewis and Fernando, while Norbert Haug's just sort of twiddling with his BlackBerry and looking down, looking like he doesn't want to be there. So eventually,
doesn't want to be alive.
Indeed, he wants what, like those fairground things where you put your 10p in the slot or your pound in the slot, and the grabbing hand comes down, and is it going to pick up the soft toy or isn't it? He wants that to come down. Pick me, extract
Take me away,
from
carry
this
me out of
place.
here.
I looked up at one point and I saw Martin Whitmarsh, the CEO, looking down from this upper balustrade thunderously. And sure enough, he turned up and took over for Norbert at the end because he realised this was just a horrendous scenario. It was made worse because McLaren's head of communications had taken that week off. Because if you recall, people always used to say, "Oh, Hungary, it's boring," and they would take that. They'd go on holiday. Even some of the TV commentators would take the Hungarian Grand Prix off because they thought it would be absolutely nothing will happen off track or on. So yeah, this completely unfettered madness broke out, and I think that sort of exposed the pus-filled wound that was the for Alonso Hamilton driver relationship.
I mean, thank you for taking me there, because I mean, I watched all of that from afar, but it's so great to hear the stories from like people who are on the ground. Obviously,
you'll be keeping your mouth shut while eating a peach in future, won't you? Just in case you run into Ron Dennis
the same way again. Yeah, I mean, I've heard stories about Ron Dennis that he didn't suffer fools gladly. No one journalist who attempted to interview him without wearing any shoes, and Ron was not. He was not having a barefoot journalist trying to ask Ron Dennis a question. Imagine all he's thinking is, just stop talking so I can yell at you about how you don't have shoes on.
Well, there was the photographer who was shooting on behalf of the McLaren magazine once at some event or something. And Ron said to him, "I thought you didn't work for me because you're not wearing a suit."
Boy, what a guy. Obviously has a very successful period at McLaren, and then you couldn't argue it was successful, his return. Fernando Alonso, I guess he didn't have a successful first stint at McLaren, had an even less successful return. But I mean, these are names that we're still talking about. And one of the real men of the moment, Adrian Newey, was probably on the move somewhere, but he had his time at McLaren, again, very successful. Don't know that he's going to be going back there, but it just really, like I said, it just sort of captures so much about what's going on in Formula One right now. And you read about these things 30 years ago, and it's like, oh, well, it's all playing out, all the same stuff.
Yeah, it's very much Back to the Future, isn't it? Certainly with Adrian Newey, left McLaren because he wanted a sort of a more senior position, or in his autobiography, he describes a poolside meeting in the south of France on holiday where Ron Dennis said that to Adrian and Martin Whitmarsh that he was going to move on at some point and he would probably pass some sort of control of the company or ownership onto them, but there was no actual timescale set for that, as he wanted their eternal loyalty and fealty, kiss the Pope's ring and sign up for a long-term contract. And Adrian wasn't really up for that. He wanted a timescale. And he said that basically was the point around which his relationship with Ron Dennis pivoted. And it was kind of the beginning of the end of his time at McLaren. And that he thinks that they then instituted the matrix management system of technical directorship and the way the whole technical thing was managed as a means of clipping his wings. It's what's interesting is that I had a bit of a celebrity proofreader for this book. Randomly and weirdly, this is slightly to go off at a tangent, or in the words of saloon car racer Steve Soper, I went off on a tandem. I got a random email out the blue. Yeah, I got a random email out of the blue around January this year, just as the book was kind of going to being designed and in its final stages of printing. This email came from Neil Oakley, who of course still works for McLaren as a consultant, still goes in at the factory, designed a lot of the race-winning McLaren cars. And he was saying, "Oh, I saw on Amazon that you've got this book coming out. If you need to just run it by me to check for stuff, then I'd love to." So I sent him the whole book, and if he was, he's a massive fan of racing cars, as you can imagine, because that's his life. And so he actually didn't make that many, he didn't point out that many mistakes or whatever until, and there were a few observations here and there, a few more nuances as we got to his period of why things were done in a certain way. When we got to the whole business of matrix management, let's just say he had a very different idea of the purpose of that system than Adrian knew he did.
So how many pages or how much red tape did he sort of put over your pages? Or was it just a bit like, here's the worst thing that you got wrong, let me just maybe give you a different perspective?
No, he sent me a long text document with just basically his observations here and
all
there.
Of his
so
receipts.
There's no sort of crossings out, no receipts, just basically a few things saying, well, actually, we went to that engine for this reason.
Yeah.
And so he had a few quibbles about some of those Newey era things where probably I'd related Newey's point of view a little too much rather than being more nuanced. So he helps it achieve probably a bit more of a nuanced point of view. And there are also some quite amusing inside stories. So the car on the cover, which is the one that was withdrawn in Monaco because it had the high wings, you'll notice that those high wings are color coded to match the rest of the car. Now, it never appeared like that in period. The wings were completely metal; they were unpainted aluminium, and Neil sort of had a little bit of a cheeky aside and said, "Yes, this was a Ron thing." When he was persuaded to actually allow the car out of mothballs and put on display, he didn't like the fact that the wings were a different color to the rest of the car, so he ordered that they be repainted. He said, "If we're going to have papaya, then the whole thing's got to be papaya." It's since been restored back to original aluminium unpainted spec, but that picture was taken 2 or 3 years ago before the restoration took place. So it's quite funny. And the interesting thing I got from Neil is that although he's clearly very aware of Ron's eccentricities, he's still completely loyal to him and regards him as a great and misunderstood man. And I think that's probably the best way to see Ron Dennis. He had quirks and eccentricities, but a great entrepreneur, a visionary, and someone who was really, really loyal to his staff. And I think actually, if you look back at 2007, it was his loyalty to his people that cost him and the team, because he stood by people who actually were up to a little bit of chicanery, because he didn't think that anyone who worked for him would do something like that. I don't think he was lying when he said he didn't know, or people in the team didn't have access to this stuff. It actually didn't compute in his brain that anyone who would work for him would cheat in that way.
But then didn't Lewis tell the stewards one story and then have to go back and say, "I'm very sorry, I would like to update my story"? So how does that gel with what Ron was trying to do?
It's 2009 Australian Grand Prix, wasn't it? The chicanery behind the safety car.
Oh,
now.
Yeah.
Oh, that was quite a while ago, 15 years ago, actually, wasn't it? Now, if memory serves, Ron might actually have been, he might have voluntarily stepped back, or he was in the process of stepping back at that time, because he realised that basically the heat was never going to come off the team in the Mosley era until he stepped back. So Martin Whitmarsh was being put in charge, and it was basically a scheme cooked up by the team manager, who said, if we tell this in a different way in front of the stewards, we'll get away with it. So he ended up being fired for being economical with the actuality, and Lewis was hauled over the coals for basically what he said was he was interviewed by a journalist as he walked back into the paddock and said what actually happened, and then at the team meeting, when they were told that you've got to go to the stewards, there was a decision made somewhere a lot in there by the team manager to slightly finesse the story as was put to the stewards. And when that was published, the journalist in question went to Charlie Whiting and said, "You might want to listen to my digital voice recorder." And that was what kicked it all off.
Wow. you said something before that triggered something that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the coming back to the cars. They're so iconic, and the Marlboro livery. And when you were talking about Ron like altering the look of the car to make it look better, to restore it, and to present it the way it was up here for him. I was started thinking about like, oh yeah, they probably like when they change from one sponsor to another, they probably have to discreetly kind of strip that sponsor. But then there must be some that are so iconic that they can't do that. They even if they want to, they couldn't do that.
Well, you say that, but many, many years ago, I did briefly work for the McLaren magazine that I alluded to. This was sort of the turn of the 2000s. And around that time, they were really, really hot on only showing current sponsors.
Yeah.
And at that time, Ron was still very much of the opinion that McLaren history pre his arrival on the scene was not worth going into. He viewed McLaren as a loser brand. In actual fact, in 1980, he actually wanted to kill it off. He sort of thought, I want the Marlboro money for my own organisation. I don't want to carry someone else's name, especially this loser brand that's been designing no-go cars for the past couple of years. So he always had a bit of a dysfunctional relationship with the team's history pre him. So all sorts of madness happened. I remember we had there would be an item photographed in a studio and presented over a spread, and its history explained. And one of those was an original Bruce McLaren racing helmet, still with a few stone chips in the paintwork, but also with a Gulf logo on the front because that was his fuel sponsor. Would you believe that the poor art department of this magazine was instructed to retouch via Photoshop? Other photo editing apps are available. To retouch all the stone chips out and the Gulf logo. And there were various pictures that we could not use because there was a lady who would look at the layouts and was their sponsorship guru, and she'd sort of look at each spread as if it was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off in her face. And you would have the tiniest shot of a crash helmet. And she'd go, oh, no, we can't use that. We can't use that. You go, why? And there'd be like a sponsor on the eyebrow of the visor that wasn't with them anymore. So we couldn't use that picture.
I did work.
We were also in an era where...
Go ahead.
So we were also in an era of digital photography just coming in.
Just a moment.
But you couldn't actually use the pictures large at that point because the technology wasn't mature enough. And the bigger you enlarge the pictures, the grainier they'd get. And also the color fidelity would disappear. Yeah. So very often you'd have the brand new up-to-date pictures would have been done on digital and you couldn't use them large. So you'd have all these arguments saying, well, this picture that we don't like that you've used on the spread, can you get rid of that and use this other picture? You have to say sort of no, because that silver is going to look just like a mucky grey.
Yuck.
And it's all going to look very pixelated.
I understand that you're the writer, not the photographer, but I did want to ask a question about the photos in the book, because as I was flicking through, I sort of realized like, there's photos here where David Coulthard and Mika Hakkinen have spun out. There's photos here of someone trapped in the gravel trap. You really did them dirty. But then I realized, I know what he's done. I mean, number one, the photos are probably complementing the words, but number two, it's the drama and it tells the story, and that's how you illustrate what happened. And it's not a love letter to a brand. It's what life was like on the track.
Well, exactly. You did have moments where David Coulthard took Mika Hakkinen out, accidentally or otherwise, and cars do fail, drivers do fail, and those pictures are among the more interesting ones. And certainly, I think one of the challenges of Formula One photography is that there's so much ugly furniture around circuits. Armco,
sponsor
poles,
boards.
Marshalls picking their noses, sponsor boards, ambulances in the background,
Yeah.
chicken wire fencing, radio aerials, stuff like that. So the eminent photographer Darren Heath used to bemoan pictures where it looked like there was a telegraph pole sticking out the back of the cockpit because the photographer hadn't stood in the right place, and he'd sort of say, could have moved. I don't know why I've made Darren Heath sound like Ron Dennis, but it's, they could have moved 2 steps to the left, and that wouldn't have happened.
I believe Darren got that great photo of the McLaren with the multiple brake pedals as well. I think that was one of his. I'm pretty sure I'm right.
You are correct, and it was I think I had to edit out the description in the book because running out of space, and it would have taken half the word count to explain the scenario in full. But yes, what had happened was my illustrious predecessor as editor of GP Racing magazine, F1 Racing as it was then, had arranged with Darren to drop him a message if either of the McLarens dropped out, because Darren had a race or two previously got a really weird picture in a pan shot of one of the McLarens where the front brake disc wasn't glowing, but one of the rear brake discs was. So it was clear that there's something funny going on here. So and there was word coming out of other teams as well, because other teams had been trying to do this and failing, which makes the fact that McLaren did it with like some bits worth a few quid all the more incredible. But it was known that something was happening. So for that, I think it was the Austrian Grand Prix. Matt Bishop, my predecessor, was watching on TV at home with his mobile on, and when the McLarens retired, he texted Darren to say McLarens are out at this corner. So Darren went to go and do the shots in the cockpit. Yeah, sprinted off with his 600mm lens clanking off his back. Got there before they put the car on the back of the truck, just shoved his camera in. It's the least elegant Darren Heath shot that will ever be published, of the flash gun going off inside the footwell of the Mercedes, the McLaren. And there you go, the extra brake pedal.
I've seen the photo, and I always wonder. I always thought he must have been tipped off by whoever, because, like you say, he doesn't typically frame photos that way. He doesn't typically drop his camera in a cockpit hoping that there's something interesting in there. He's much more likely to consider the background, get the framing right. And I've been lucky enough to be in the press room a few times here in Australia, but I've always spotted him because he's the one with his laptop, basically a black tent that his head is under while he edits his photos. I mean, meticulous doesn't even begin to start to
he's like Mr. Spock on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, isn't he, with that hood, that mysterious glowing thing he stares into.
But yeah, you're right. It's funny to imagine him sort of just leaning under and going click and then going, got it, I got it, everybody.
Yeah. I'll tell you a funny Darren story if you want.
Yeah. Oh no, thanks. No, we don't do funny on the show.
Because Darren's very, very meticulous with his work, with his framing, with his planning of shots. So I was only half mocking when I said that was the only this dirty shot with a flash gun in a McLaren footwell was the only shot like that you'd ever see of Darren's published. So he never lets anyone see anything of his work that's less than perfect. Hence the tent. Mm-hmm. And there was one time I was working in sports car racing, and Darren did a one-off trip to this particular sports car race, which was at Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Motor Speedway. And he was sharing a room with another photographer. I popped round to visit them to sort of say, how's it going? And the other guy opened the door. Darren was in the shower, and this being the age before, long before Darren embraced digital photography, Darren's prints, or the transparency film slides, were all in these transparent plastic envelopes on just lying on the bed. So I went, oh, are these Darren shots? And I barely touched one of them and picked it up to look at it in the light from the window. Then Darren came steaming out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist, going, "No!" As if the room was full of gas, and I was just about to flick the light switch on, because the the way Darren shot back in the day of motor drives and transparency film was highly experimental. So he would happily waste a whole roll of film with a really, really experimental sort of low shutter speed panning shot, knowing that a lot of these a lot of the images would actually be ugly and useless, but there'd be the one that looked absolutely perfect. And so he couldn't countenance anyone seeing the fails. He only ever wanted anyone to see the ones that had succeeded, because basically he's a perfectionist and not an adequatist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm keen to hear about the treatment of all the personalities and the drivers. Obviously, I love Mika Hakkinen. He was my guy. I had his poster on my wall when I was, 20 years old. He wrote the foreword for this book, so obviously, it's like ordained already. I love it. But you got Mika Hakkinen, Niki Lauda, James Hunt, Fittipaldi, all these great drivers to talk about. How much of a temptation was there to sort of flower them up? Senna, I mean, the obvious one, Senna, who's just, on everyone's mind this weekend in particular. How much of it is like, Senna was there, but also I have to talk about the car. So how do you balance it?
Yeah, it's a tough one. But the good thing is that very often the drivers and their approaches are very much bound in with what happened with the car. So, you had in the early 70s, Emerson Fittipaldi joining the team, very much putting his stamp on the development of the M23. Before then, before Bruce McLaren's death, he was intimately involved in the design and construction of the cars and their development. And you could argue that what the team lacked in those very early 70s after his death was the touch of the driver stroke engineer who could not just drive a car and think, oh, it's doing this, but also have an idea, have the new part drawn in his head before he pulled into the pits to cure it. And I suppose with Mika, he will have had less of an input on car development, but certainly Senna knew what he wanted. I think, maybe the trickiest bit was to address, should we say, the fails of the great drivers, because Senna, people are going to be unsubscribing to your podcast in droves for the blasphemy I'm about to utter. But Senna did have his off moments when he took Alan Prost out at the beginning of the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix. Absolutely ludicrous act of sabotage. And I think, if memory serves, I probably said in the book, it might have been cut out to make the bit fit the space, but he did probably come to regret doing that afterwards. It was a bit of a moment of madness. Mika did go off the boil by his own admission certain times in 2000, 2001, and he was happy with that. But Mika's such a funny guy now. He happily admits that back in the day he was a bit professional, a bit taciturn. He's hilarious to meet now. He refers to David Coulthard as the David. I don't know why.
The David.
He's very funny, but also in that great racing driver way, completely disconnected from real life. Because last year, I don't know if you recall, last year, the summer bank holiday, there was, depending on which viewpoint you subscribe to, either a Russian or Chinese state hack on the UK air traffic control system, or a French pilot pressed the wrong button and on their flight plan, and it brought UK airspace to its knees. That caused me and my wife to be marooned in Madeira. We were supposed to be flying back from our holiday that day, and we didn't get home for another 2 or 3 days via a very roundabout route. When Mika heard this, he said, "Why didn't you get a private plane?"
Send yours, Mika. I'll jump in anytime.
So I said, surely you've got a Gulfstream that doesn't, it wasn't being used on the day or the day after.
I love hearing any stories about Mika, because he seems like, he has that sort of persona of being the cool man of few words. And Kimi Räikkönen came along later and really showed us what a man of few words was really like. But everyone thinks of Mika as being like sitting at the press interview and sort of just saying, well, I don't know, you'd have to ask the team. But I mean, I know that there's stories about him. So anytime I talk to anyone who knows anything about him, like I remember, like chasing down Heikki Coulter saying, like, tell me all the Mika stories, please. Anything you've got, I'll take anything. So definitely, if you've got more in the tank about Mika, this is where I want you to unleash it on me.
He did tell me about how he tried when he was teammates with Johnny Herbert. Did he jump in the bath with Johnny, or Johnny tried to get him to jump in the bath with him, or something like that? He'd stitched Johnny up with something to do with the bath.
Well, maybe some stories are best left untold. Also, I feel like Johnny Herbert probably tells the best version of that story after a few drams. But
oh yeah,
yeah. I mean, maybe I'll corner him one day and get that word out of him. But yeah, definitely wondering for people who might be listening who are just like, oh, why isn't he talking about the other drivers? What are the great stories about those drivers, or what's their story in the cars? For people who are new to Formula One, for example, I mean, what are the sort of highlights? So, what are the things that people ask you about when you say I'm writing a book about McLaren, and they go, oh, are you going to mention this?
Well, it depends on how old the person is. Those with even more grey hair than me, they sort of look down their nose as if to say, "You'd better not get the 1960s wrong, son."
Sure.
And so yeah, then you get to the 1970s, and they want to hear all about James Hunt. I think there's a big James Hunt cult still. That's a sentence you have to enunciate carefully, isn't it? End up like John Inverdale and his glasses.
Put the explicit tag on the podcast. It's fine.
The whole thing of James Hunt, which has kind of surfaced in people's minds with that great film Rush. 10 or 11 years back. I know it's not to everyone's taste because the cars don't change through the year, and the V12 cars are actually powered by V8, and they don't have the right number of rivets and all that sort of thing. There's an anorak
falling on my shoulders.
Well, I enjoyed the film. It does a great job of kind of telling the story with a broad brush. Yes. and being accessible. I know there's various things that never happened, and I know that Crystal Palace turns into Cadwell Park halfway through, and that Paul Ricard is actually Brands Hatch. All that. Lovely story, well told. Fuji Speedway airport airstrip near Frimley. Yeah, I don't care. Everyone loves that sort of James Hunt vibe because he was a character. He sort of didn't suffer fools gladly, but he also was a very, very good driver, which I think people don't give him credit for. He was also very, very nervous before the race. Apparently, he routinely vomit before a race. Thankfully, unlike some other racing drivers in history, he got that over with before he got in the car.
I'm Australian. Remember,
unlike Roberto Moreno in Benetton, where they'd have to scrape it out after the race, or the peas and carrots in the far crevices of the cockpit. Everyone loves that whole sort of James Hunt mythos that's grown up, and they want current racing drivers to have that sort of swagger. And I think that's what Drive to Survive has given some of the drivers, say the Daniel Ricciardos, and it's made some people arguably bigger stars than they might be. Like I don't think Gunter Steiner would be as well known as he is if he didn't drop the F-bomb quite so frequently during episodes of Drive to Survive. So I think that the people who are big personalities there percolate to the top in the edit, because Netflix films everything. So I always think I must be really, really boring because I've not been seen on screen once in this program. I did do a thing once. I was at the Salzburg Ring with Nico Hulkenberg, and they were filming it as well. And I had to sign a model release form and all that sort of thing. They didn't use a nanosecond of it.
Someone wanted to make you feel special that day, but it was a bit cruel.
Yeah, I think some goober in an edit suite going, "Oh, get rid of him. This is useless."
I feel like if you had sworn, they probably would have fallen over themselves to include it, and that would have been, a whole episode about that.
I think next time I see, because the arrival of a boom microphone in your peripheral vision always heralds the arrival of a Netflix camera. Maybe I should just sort of inadvertently develop Tourette's syndrome.
Just slag off a few of the drivers or the show in general, or whatever you like. Yeah. So they love controversy, and they'll chase it. You were going to say before about the Senna legacy and maybe some of the not so great points. I feel like one of the and the James Hunt, Larrikin, and what would you say, loose character on the track and off. But one of the points of the
Larrikin's a
Senna
great word.
legacy, one of the things about the Senna legacy that I struggle with personally is the mantra: if there's a gap and you don't go for it, you're no longer a racing car driver. I feel like over the years, and it's not Senna's fault, but over the years, that's been used to justify some really shitty driving, and it's come up a lot lately, even the last couple of months. That phrase just keeps coming up. Why is that driver dive bombing down the corner? Oh, well, if you don't go for a gap, you're no longer a race driver. It's like, yeah, but you don't need to be a tool either.
Yeah, mute anyone on social media who says if
Yes.
you no longer go for a gap, you are no longer a racing driver. I mean, if you go for a gap that's closing, it just makes you a bit of a nitwit, doesn't it? You know, whether
It's not
you're
a
a
smart thing to do.
scooterist. I once, as a motorcyclist, and I used to live in London, I used to have to go around the Wandsworth one-way system on the way back from the office every night. And routinely, you'd see scooterists diving up the underneath of buses that were turning left to leave the gyratory system. And you could see this gap closing. And you go, you never,
Yeah.
no, you're never going to
That's
make
not
it. No,
gonna
just
happen.
don't. And it's not going to happen. And you see this all the time. We saw it in the Monaco Grand Prix where Kevin Magnussen put the nose of his car and his front wheels into a gap that was always going to be diminishing, because this isn't his first Monaco rodeo. That road does a bit of a wiggle as it goes up the hill. And also look at the person he's got his wheels inside, Sergio Perez, who's not someone who goes, oh, all right, I'll just jump out
Yeah.
of your way then. There you go, come past. Don't, I'm in the fastest car. I'm in the fastest car of the year, and I'm at the back of the grid. So tell you what, why don't you just make me look even more a fool and come steaming past? I'll
Yeah.
lay down here. I'll roll out a red carpet for you. There's some nice picnic stuff at the end as well for you. There you go. Knock yourself out, Kevin. He's never going to say that, is he? So diving for a gap like that was slightly amateurish. In fact, one of my dear colleagues on Autosport, when he would see driving like that, used to whistle the opening bars of Amateur Hour by Sparks.
Yes, love that. Saw Sparks recently. Yeah, absolutely. That's a reference that lands hard with me. I mean, I feel like, I told you we would get chatting, and the next thing you know, an hour would be gone. But I would love to just even wind the clock right back, because looking through the book, this is something I didn't really know much about, and I still don't. The friendship and the relationship between Bruce McLaren and Jack Brabham, because obviously being Australian, I have to ask you about Jack Brabham. So, I mean, how important was Jack Brabham as a figure and just what he achieved in the sport to the whole McLaren story, kicking it off?
Massively. Well, he played a key role in bringing Bruce McLaren over, and I think he proved that you could come from the Southern Hemisphere and make it big in what was still a very European form of racing, and a little bit parochially European as well.
Yes.
I mean, it was more parochially European then. So he came from, he made his name in dirt track racing in Australia. And the thing that I think set Jack Brabham apart from anyone else at the time, other people have come along who've been mechanically gifted or able since, but the fact that he had an intrinsic understanding of the engineering principles of a car and how it worked. Oops, sorry, there goes my cold again. He had an intrinsic understanding of how a racing car worked, how it should be set up, how it should behave. And when you read about things like, he'd already won his first world championship with Cooper, and then he came back the next year and got beaten by a Lotus in the first championship race of the season, and on the plane back sat down and thought, this car needs to change. And the team boss and the designer said, no, it doesn't. We just won the world championship with it. We're miles ahead of anyone else. He said, no, this car needs to change, and this is what we're going to do. And did it, won his second world championship because of that, because he realized that they were going to be outdeveloped. And then when you look at what he did when he started his own team, the cleverness with the move to 3 litres and him sourcing the Repco engine, and the hoops he had to jump through to get the engines to Europe. Like you read some of his memoirs. I listened to some. There's some great oral history stuff in the Library of Australia of interviews with him describing how he would fly to Australia to pick up the engines and escort them practically back to Europe, because inevitably the airline would lose them. And he was saying about how he'd flown to Australia, he'd watched them put the engines on the plane, got back to London. Oh, sorry, mate. No engines. He's gone, and then a fortnight later, BA ringing him saying, when are you going to pick up these engines that we've had of yours for the last 2 weeks? So he was a great entrepreneur. He also taught Ron Dennis everything he knew, because Ron Dennis was just a mechanic at Brabham. And Jack trusted him with a suitcase full of money to pay for some engines or some work somewhere. And Ron, being meticulous and honest, didn't even look in it, but he knew how much money was in it. And he thought, I'm in the wrong game. I need to move up in this. Yeah. And that's what set him on the road to being a team manager in his own right, and a businessman and an entrepreneur. So yeah, I think Sir Jack Brabham you look back at as being not just a great driver, but also a very clever entrepreneur and a very gifted engineer. And you don't see a lot of drivers melding all those qualities within the lifespan of their careers. Jackie Stewart, obviously great businessman, knows his own worth, knew his own worth at the time, never made less than X million a year after retiring. Very, very great at what he did. And he'll happily tell you how many millions he made a year after retiring. He also someone I very much look up to in terms of their ability to, make motor racing work for them while also putting back into motor racing. So yeah, I think Sir Jack Brabham, Formula One owes him a considerable debt for basically shaping it.
Yeah, I mean, just even those names that you just mentioned there. I mean, some of the real big names in the sport, and obviously Brabham is a big name. But yeah, I mean, I didn't realize how deep all those connections went. So thank you. All that and so much more sits within the pages of this amazing book, which comes out in just a couple of weeks. Obviously, people can pre-order now, but what you want to do is go and buy one for you, then buy one for your dad for Father's Day or Christmas, and buy one for your friend who's just getting into Formula One, and just buy all of that stuff and get the hardcover, because you want it to last. And I had this realization recently that obviously we're all working remote now, and more than ever before, people are like framing their, I mean, I'm terrible, but people are framing their backdrops with like minifigure helmets or, special, yourself, obviously, we're alike in this regard, but others do this. Oh, my motorcycle helmet just happens to be just sitting there propped and, perfectly positioned. But, books like this, man, if you're one of those people who like manicure your background, pop one of these in there.
Yeah, like those British politicians that have a flag artfully placed and a load of books, just intellectual sounding books they've never read. Yeah. Yes. Biographies of Churchill and stuff. They can't even spell his name. Don't just buy my book, buy it from a proper independent bookshop.
Love that.
You can buy them from Amazon, but why should you pay for Jeff Bezos to blast himself into space when you could be keeping proper people who know what they're doing in business?
Do it to spite Bezos. That's what I like to say. Spend more to spite him. Codders, I hope this isn't the last time that we talk. Next time, when you drop your book about Spiker or whatever, let's have another chat.
Yeah, I've got something about the live team that I've just desperate to get and put onto the genesis of the W12 engine or whatever it was. Yes, let's write a whole book about that, and all of 3 people will buy it.
Well, I'll buy 2 just to make up for the numbers. Thanks so much. It's been a great chat, and I'll talk to you again next time.